You are no longer our daughter. My father sent me that text message at 8 in the evening, exactly 14 hours before I was scheduled to walk down the aisle and marry my husband. I was sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in downtown Seattle. The rain was hitting the glass in thick, heavy sheets. My wedding dress was hanging on the closet door, wrapped in a white garment bag. My phone vibrated against the nightstand. I picked it up and read the sentence. 6 words. No phone call. No preamble. Just an eviction notice from my own family delivered via text. A minute later, a notification popped up beneath it. My mother, Susan, had liked the message. She did not call to soften the blow or explain. She simply endorsed it. The crime that warranted my removal from the family tree was a seating chart. I had refused to allow their adopted daughter to bring 3 unleashed dogs and 4 random friends to my strict 50-person botanical greenhouse wedding. That was it. 3 years later, they came back. Not because they missed me, but because they needed my signature on a single piece of paper. The 5 words I typed back to them dismantled their financial future and collapsed my father's early retirement plan. Before I explain how a single document exposed a decade of deception, take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one of them. My name is Willow Carter. I am 32 years old. I live in Washington State and work as a senior underwriter. I spend 40 hours a week assessing risk, calculating liabilities, and reading the fine print. But the biggest risk I ever took was believing my parents would put my needs first for just one day. Let me take you back to the month before the wedding. Evan and I paid for everything ourselves. We found a stunning glass-walled greenhouse just outside the city. It smelled like damp earth and jasmine. It had a hard fire code limit of 50 guests. Every chair was accounted for. 3 weeks before the date, my mother called me. She did not ask how the planning was going. She spoke with the brisk managerial tone she used whenever the topic involved my sister, Mia. My parents adopted Mia when I was 14 and she was 10. From the moment Mia crossed our threshold, my achievements were boxed up and put in the garage to make room for her needs. I was the shock absorber. I worked weekend shifts at a local coffee shop to buy my own exam prep books, while my father bought Mia a brand new Jeep Wrangler for her 16th birthday, calling her his miracle. So when my mother called that Tuesday, I already knew the script. Mia is going to be your maid of honor, Susan told me over the phone. And she needs a reserved table for her friends and her dogs because she gets anxious at large gatherings. I pulled up my seating spreadsheet on my monitor. The venue is at capacity, Mom, I said. It is a strict 50-person limit. Mia is invited as a guest, but she cannot bring 5 extra people and 3 animals to a greenhouse. The silence on the line was cold. You are punishing your sister because you are jealous, Susan said. You need to fix this, Willow. The ultimatum was laid bare. I had yielded my entire life to keep the peace. But looking at that spreadsheet, I realized I was done shrinking. I took a breath and said the word I had not used in a decade. No. You cannot understand a text message erasing 32 years of history without understanding the invisible ledger kept in our house. When I was 14, my parents adopted Mia. She was 10 years old at the time. They did not just welcome her into our split-level house in Tacoma. They canonized her. From the moment she crossed the threshold, the rules of our household shifted. My parents, Richard and Susan, began systematically erasing my presence to make physical and emotional room for her trauma. They created an environment where 2 entirely different childhoods were happening simultaneously under the exact same roof. There was my version of childhood. I remember a Tuesday evening in late October. I came home from debate practice holding a regional first-place plaque. I walked into my bedroom to find my bookshelf stripped bare, my debate trophies, my science fair ribbons, the framed certificate from the state spelling bee. Every trace of my academic effort was gone. I found them 3 hours later inside a damp cardboard box out in the garage. The box was shoved behind the heavy lawnmower, smelling of stale gasoline and wet grass clippings. I walked back inside and found my mother in the living room. She had cleared my shelves to display Mia's pristine cheerleading pom-poms and a matching uniform. When I asked Susan about the box in the garage, she did not even turn around. She just kept folding laundry and told me Mia needed to feel like she takes up space. "You are secure, Willow," she said without looking up. "You do not need plastic trophies to prove your worth." So I learned to stop taking up space. My childhood smelled like burnt espresso and industrial floor sanitizer. At 16, I started working weekend shifts at a local coffee shop. My alarm would go off at 4 in the morning. I would walk 2 miles in the freezing Washington drizzle just to tie a canvas apron around my waist. I wiped down sticky counters, burned my wrists on the metal milk steam wand, and smiled at impatient commuters. I did this so I could save enough tip money to buy my own college preparation materials. I remember sitting on the floor of my bedroom, tracing the spine of a thick Princeton Review study guide I bought with crumpled dollar bills. I studied in the dark while the rest of the house slept. Nobody noticed my efforts. Nobody asked to check my practice scores. My future was entirely my own burden to carry. Then there was Mia's version of childhood. Her version was a parade. I will never forget her 16th birthday. I was 20 years old, home from my sophomore year of college for a brief weekend. Richard and Susan led Mia out to the concrete driveway, with their hands covering her eyes. Sitting there catching the afternoon sun was a pristine white Jeep Wrangler. A red velvet bow stretched across the hood. The tires were glossy black, and the dealer plates were still attached. Richard handed her the heavy metal keys, and actually called her his miracle. He looked at her the way a man looks at a priceless artifact he unearthed himself. I stood on the porch, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, watching them embrace. My father had paid cash for that vehicle. He did not hesitate. He did not talk about budgets or tightening belts. The ledger was open and the funds were unlimited as long as the recipient was Mia. 2 months after the car reveal, I sat at the kitchen table with my financial aid forms spread out over the placemats. My academic scholarship covered a significant portion of my tuition, but I was short $4,000 for the upcoming fall semester. I waited until Richard sat down with his morning newspaper. I did not ask for a handout. I presented a typed repayment plan. I asked my parents for a loan that I promised to pay back with standard interest after graduation. Richard folded his newspaper. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with an expression of mild inconvenience. "Willow, you know Mia is struggling with her math tutor costs right now," he said, "and she needs a high-end laptop for her media class." He leaned back in his chair. "Mia needs us more right now. You are smart. You will figure it out." I gathered my papers, slid them into my manila folder, and stood up from the table. I did not argue. I did figure it out. I took on a third job working night shifts at the campus library. I shelved heavy textbooks under buzzing fluorescent lights until 2 in the morning. I drank cheap black tea to stay awake through my early morning lectures. I graduated with honors. When the commencement ceremony arrived, the seats reserved for my family sat empty. Nobody came to watch me cross the stage. Susan called me later that afternoon to explain that Mia had experienced a minor anxiety episode that morning and simply could not be left alone in the house. I packed up my dorm room in silence. I mailed my own diploma to myself in a flat, cardboard envelope. For a decade, I was the designated shock absorber. I smiled at tense holiday dinners. I stepped out of the frame during family photos so Mia could stand closer to Richard. I said yes whenever they demanded a favor. I shrank my entire existence so Mia could expand into every corner of their lives. I became a master at reading the room and neutralizing the tension before it could escalate. But resentment does not disappear just because you remain silent. It calcifies. It hardens over time like bone until you realize you do not feel anger anymore. You just feel cold. I built my own life in Seattle. I rented a small apartment with scratched hardwood floors and a view of a brick wall. It was not glamorous, but it was mine. I listened to the rhythmic clanking of the old iron radiator in the corner and felt a profound sense of relief. I paid the rent on time every single month. I opened my own utility bills. I bought my own groceries. I started working as a junior underwriter, and climbed the corporate ladder through sheer relentless focus. I liked the predictability of my job. I liked that risk could be calculated and mitigated on a spreadsheet. I did not leave home. Home made it clear that the roster was full. There was only one slot available for a daughter, and that slot had been permanently awarded to someone else. The physical distance gave me clarity. I realized that my parents did not love me less because I was flawed. They ignored me because I was competent. My independence was a convenient excuse for their neglect. They treated my self-reliance as a hall pass to abandon their parental duties. But the true irony was that while they ignored me on a personal level, they still demanded my obedience on a systemic level. They still believed they held the reins to my life. They assumed the invisible ledger was still active, and that I owed them my perpetual submission simply because they provided a roof over my head during high school. By the time Evan proposed to me under the string lights of a quiet restaurant patio, I had constructed a reality that did not require my parents' approval. I had a career, a partner, and a quiet sense of peace. But toxic systems do not dismantle themselves willingly. When the wedding invitations went out, my parents looked at my guest list and saw an opportunity to test their control. They thought I would hand over my wedding day the exact same way I had handed over my childhood bedroom. They thought I would yield. They did not realize that the girl who boxed up her own trophies was gone. Evan and I stood in the quiet lobby of our local bank branch, waiting for the teller to print a cashier's check. The paper felt heavy in my hands. It represented 2 years of shared savings, disciplined budgeting, and overtime hours. Evan works as an urban planner for the city. He spends his days analyzing zoning laws, drafting blueprints, and understanding the physical limits of a given environment. He brought that same quiet, grounded logic into our relationship. We did not want a sprawling ballroom spectacle funded by parental strings. We wanted an intimate gathering that belonged entirely to us. We handed that cashier's check over to secure a restored botanical greenhouse in Woodinville, just a short drive outside the city limits. The venue was stunning. It featured wrought iron arches framing thick panes of antique glass. Rare orchids and towering ferns brushed against the shoulders of anyone walking down the narrow stone aisles. Because of the delicate botanical exhibits and strict county fire regulations, the greenhouse had a hard capacity limit. 50 humans, not 55, not 51. Exactly 50 people were allowed inside the structure. We rented exactly 50 wooden crossback chairs. We ordered exactly 50 plates of locally sourced food from our caterer. I tracked every single penny and every single guest on a locked Excel spreadsheet. There were no +1s for people we had never met. There were no obligatory invitations for distant relatives who only called when they needed money. The guest list was a highly curated sanctuary. 21 days before the ceremony, I was sitting at our kitchen island. I had a stack of thick ivory envelopes in front of me. I was carefully pressing wax seals onto the final vendor payment letters. My phone vibrated against the marble countertop. The caller ID displayed my mother, Susan. I answered the call, expecting a routine question. I thought she might ask for the address of the rehearsal dinner or the specific dress code for the evening reception. I was wrong. Susan did not say hello. She bypassed any form of polite greeting and launched directly into a series of mandates. She spoke with the brisk, authoritative tone of a corporate manager, delegating tasks to a subordinate. "Mia is going to stand beside you as your maid of honor," Susan announced over the phone. I stopped pressing the wax stamp. My actual maid of honor was Sarah. Sarah was my college roommate. When I was working 3 jobs to pay my tuition, Sarah would leave plates of warm food on my desk so I would remember to eat. Sarah sat on the floor of my cramped apartment, holding my hand when I was sick. Mia, on the other hand, rarely remembered my birthday. I was not going to bump the woman who kept me afloat to provide a photo opportunity for the sister who watched me sink. Before I could form a response, Susan pushed forward with the rest of her agenda. "And Mia needs a designated table near the front for her support network," Susan continued. "She is bringing 4 of her closest friends. She also needs clearance for her emotional support dogs. She gets very anxious at large family gatherings, and she needs her animals to keep her grounded. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. The spreadsheet was open. The blue grid lines felt like a cage. Mia traveled with 3 French bulldogs. She bought unregistered service vests for them on the internet. They lacked basic obedience training. During the previous Thanksgiving dinner, those same dogs chewed through the baseboards of my parents' dining room and destroyed a Persian rug. Now Susan expected me to allow those untrained animals to roam freely among rare botanical orchids and 50 seated guests in a glass enclosure. I felt the familiar heavy weight pressing down on my chest. It was the physical sensation of the shock absorber role activating. My trained reflex was to panic and calculate how to yield. I could call the rental company and beg for an extra folding table. I could uninvite my own coworkers. I could risk losing our entire venue security deposit to accommodate the dogs. I could shrink my presence at my own wedding so Mia could expand and consume the oxygen in the room. I looked across the living room. Evan was sitting on the sofa reviewing a stack of city permits. He was wearing a faded gray sweater. He looked up and met my eyes. He did not know what Susan was demanding on the other end of the line, but his steady presence anchored me to the present reality. I was not the teenager hiding my debate trophies in a damp garage anymore. I was a 32-year-old woman who funded her own existence. I pressed the phone closer to my ear. "Mom," I said. My voice was quiet but steady. "No." The silence that followed was distinct. It was not just a pause in the conversation. It was the sound of a structural foundation cracking wide open. I had not denied a direct order from Susan in over a decade. "Mia has a tendency to make every event center around her," I explained. I kept my tone level and professional. "This is a strict capacity venue. We are legally bound to a 50-person limit by the fire marshal. The greenhouse does not allow pets of any kind to protect the plant life. Mia is invited as a guest. She has a designated seat in the second row, but she cannot stand at the altar with me. She cannot bring a chaotic entourage, and she cannot bring 3 dogs to a formal dinner." The temperature of the conversation plummeted immediately. Susan did not yell. Yelling implies a loss of emotional control. Instead, her voice turned into crushed ice. She deployed the exact psychological weapon she always used to keep me in line. "You are punishing your sister because you are harboring deep-seated jealousy," Susan said. Her words were sharp and measured. "You have always resented her light. You are actively trying to humiliate her by excluding her support system on a day when the family should be united." I felt the heat rise in my throat. I swallowed it down. "I am enforcing a fire code and a budget," I replied. "I am protecting the financial investment Evan and I made." Susan ignored the logistics entirely. She only communicated through emotional leverage. "You need to fix this, Willow," she demanded. "You need to call the venue coordinator and make the necessary arrangements. If you choose to be this selfish, you are going to fracture this family right before your wedding." The ultimatum hung in the digital space between us. It was a clear and present threat. Yield the space, hand over the wedding, shrink back down into the designated corner so the golden child could shine. Or face the wrath of the entire family machine. In the past, that threat would have suffocated me. I would have spent the night rewriting the seating chart through blurry tears while apologizing for being difficult. This time, I let the threat sit there unanswered. I looked at the ivory envelopes on my kitchen counter. "I will see you both at the rehearsal dinner," I said. I ended the call. I did not fix it. I did not call the venue coordinator. I left the locked spreadsheet exactly as it was. I refused to yield. I went to sleep that night feeling a strange mixture of profound dread and deep liberation. By making that single choice, I set off a chain reaction. The family machine began gears turning in the background, preparing a response to my defiance. That response would culminate in a dark hotel room exactly 14 hours before I put on my wedding dress. Friday morning arrived with the sound of water hitting glass. A steady, heavy Seattle rain washed over the large windows of the bridal suite. The sky outside was a flat slate gray, the kind of weather that makes the world feel small and contained. Inside the room, the air was quiet. The climate control system hummed a low, steady rhythm. My wedding dress hung by the closet door. It was zipped inside an opaque white garment bag waiting for the afternoon. I stood near the window holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the headlights of early commuters streak across the wet pavement below. Everything felt structured. Everything was proceeding according to the timeline I had built. At exactly 8 in the morning, my phone vibrated against the mahogany nightstand. The sharp buzzing sound cut through the quiet of the suite. I walked over and picked it up, expecting a text from the florist confirming the delivery schedule or a message from my makeup artist. The screen illuminated my palm. The notification banner displayed my father's name, Richard Carter. I tapped the screen and opened the message. There was no greeting. There was no explanation. There were just 6 words typed out in stark black text. You are no longer our daughter. I stared at the screen. I waited for the typing indicator bubble to appear. I waited for a follow-up message claiming it was a typo or a misguided joke. The screen remained perfectly still. A minute passed. Then a second notification dropped down from the top of the screen. Susan Carter loved a message. My mother had used the reaction feature to attach a small digital heart to my father's eviction notice. That was the mechanism of my removal. There was no dramatic phone call. There was no shouting match. My father typed 6 words, hit send, and likely went back to eating his eggs. My mother tapped her screen to signal her approval. They orchestrated my disownment with the exact same detached efficiency they might use to cancel a newspaper subscription. They did not want a dialogue. They wanted to punish my defiance by cutting off my oxygen supply. They assumed their conditional approval was my oxygen. 5 minutes later, the real assault began. A family machine operates on a very specific protocol when the scapegoat steps out of line. The orchestrator delivers the primary blow, and then the enablers swarm to enforce the narrative. My phone began to vibrate in rapid succession. The screen lit up with a continuous stream of incoming alerts. First came the social media strike. An alert from Instagram popped up. Mia had just posted a new story. I tapped the icon. It was a photo of her holding a coffee cup, looking out a rainy window with a stylized text overlay. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to protect your peace from toxic siblings. Blood does not make you family. Choosing to love without conditions makes you family." She did not mention the venue capacity. She did not mention her untrained dogs. She painted herself as the victim of my unprovoked cruelty. She broadcasted a fabricated narrative to hundreds of followers before I even had my hair styled. Then the aunts mobilized. Aunt Carol sent a text message that spanned the entire length of my screen. Aunt Carol is my father's older sister. She has lived her entire adult life treating Richard like a financial deity because he occasionally handles her tax returns and floats her small business loans. Her loyalty is purchased annually. Willow, I cannot believe the bridezilla you have become, her message read. Your father is having heart palpitations this morning. You are breaking your mother's heart over a seating chart. Grow up and apologize to your sister. Aunt Diane chimed in a moment later. Diane is the family peacemaker who firmly believes keeping the peace means the victim should always surrender to the aggressor. How could you be so heartless on your own wedding day, she wrote. Family is all you have. Fix this before you ruin everything. I stood in the center of the hotel room reading the incoming fire. Nobody asked for my perspective. Nobody called to say, Willow, what is going on? They received their talking points from Susan and executed their roles flawlessly. They formed a firing squad designed to break my resolve and force me to beg for readmission into the family unit. I did not throw the phone. I did not scream. I walked into the bathroom and closed the door behind me. I sank to the floor. The white hexagonal tiles were freezing against my bare legs. The sharp lines of the grout pressed into my knees. I sat there with my back against the heavy wooden door. I wrapped my arms around my legs and focused on the physical sensation of the cold porcelain. I did not cry. That was the strangest part. I had spent my entire adolescence crying in secret over their preferential treatment. I had spent my 20s trying to decipher the unwritten rules of their affection. but sitting on that bathroom floor, I felt a profound, hollow clarity. The grief had already been processed years ago. I realized the true cruelty of their efficiency. They had been waiting for this moment. They had been waiting for a justifiable reason to throw me away. My independence had always been a quiet threat to their dynamic. A functional family system requires every member to play their assigned role. Mia was the fragile center of the universe. Richard was the generous savior. Susan was the martyred caretaker. My role was the invisible bank vault, the quiet corner where they could dump their excess stress and expect no resistance. By refusing to yield my wedding venue, I had broken the script. I had proven that I no longer needed their approval to exist. They could not tolerate a daughter who set boundaries, so they discarded me before I could walk down the aisle. They wanted me to spend my wedding day consumed by their absence, staring at the door, hoping they would change their minds and show up. The bathroom door handle clicked. The heavy wood pushed open slowly. Evan stood in the doorway. He was wearing his dark dress trousers and a crisp white shirt, his tie draped loosely around his neck. He looked down and saw me sitting on the tile, clutching my phone. Evan did not ask stupid questions. He did not ask what I did to provoke them. He did not suggest we call them to smooth things over. He understands the mechanics of toxic systems because he spends his life studying structural integrity. He knows when a foundation is too rotten to salvage. He lowered himself onto the bathroom floor and sat right next to me. He gently pried the phone from my fingers. He looked at the screen. He read the 6 words from Richard. He read the messages from the aunts. His jaw tightened, but his breathing remained steady. He set the device face down on the marble vanity out of reach. Evan placed his arm around my shoulders and pulled me close. He smelled like cedar and clean soap. "We do not have to manage their feelings today," he said quietly. His voice was low and firm, an anchor dropping into turbulent water. "We are not responsible for their choices. We just have to get dressed and we just have to get married." I leaned my head against his shoulder. That was the exact moment the lingering panic evaporated. The tight knot in my chest untangled itself. I was mourning a family that only existed in my imagination. The reality was right here, sitting beside me on the tile floor. I stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles from my robe. I picked up my phone from the vanity. I did not block their numbers. Blocking felt like a defensive maneuver. It felt like an emotional reaction. Instead, I held the power button down until the screen went entirely black. I walked into the bedroom, opened the drawer of the nightstand, placed the dead phone inside, and slid the drawer shut with a definitive click. I was done being the person they expected to fold. I walked over to the closet door and unzipped the white garment bag. The silk of my dress caught the gray morning light. I had a wedding to attend, and I was going to ensure that the people who chose to absent themselves would feel the permanent weight of their decision. The rain broke just past noon, leaving the air sharp and clean. We drove to the botanical greenhouse in Woodinville, under a pale silver sky. The venue sat at the end of a winding gravel drive surrounded by tall, evergreen trees. It was a stunning structure built from wrought iron arches and thick panes of antique glass. Inside, the climate was perfectly controlled. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Towering ferns and rare orchids brushed against the shoulders of the guests as they found their seats. Everything looked exactly the way Evan and I had planned it, down to the smallest detail. Evan comes from a sprawling household where people speak over each other at the dinner table, and disagreements are resolved before the dessert is served. His relatives arrived early. They filled their side of the aisle with a warm, loud energy. They carried wrapped boxes, hugged people they had just met, and laughed without hesitation. They occupied their space freely. My side of the aisle looked very different. It was populated by the people I had chosen. Sarah stood near the front holding my bouquet. My co-workers from the underwriting firm sat in the middle rows wearing dark suits and floral dresses. My college friends occupied the back. They were a quiet, steadfast presence. 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, the venue coordinator approached me in the bridal holding room. Her name was Rebecca. She carried a sleek silver clipboard and wore a dark blazer. She looked down at her seating schematic and then pointed toward the ceremony space. "Willow," she said softly. We have 3 unaccounted guests in the front row. Should I have the catering staff strike those wooden crossback chairs to close the visual gap? I walked out of the holding room and stood at the top of the aisle. I looked at the front row on my side. 3 empty wooden chairs sat side by side. Small ivory paper tags hung from the back slats printed with the names Richard, Susan, and Mia. They looked glaringly vacant against the dense crowd of seated guests. The traditional reflex would be to hide the evidence of rejection. The instinct is always to cover up the dysfunction, so the rest of the room feels comfortable. Leave them right where they are, I told Rebecca. Do not touch them. She nodded, made a single check mark on her clipboard, and walked away. I did not want to pretend my family was delayed in traffic. I did not want to erase their absence. Removing those chairs would mean hiding their cruelty to protect their reputation. Leaving the chairs forced the reality into the open light. Those 3 empty seats were not a tragedy to me. They were a monument to a closed chapter. They represented the exact physical space my family refused to occupy. The string quartet began to play. They did not play a traditional bridal march. They played a slow, modern acoustic piece. The heavy wooden doors opened. I stepped onto the stone pathway. I was walking myself down the aisle. I did not have a father to link arms with. I was not being handed off from one household to another like a piece of property. My heels clicked softly against the slate stones. The sound was steady and rhythmic. I kept my chin up and my eyes forward. As I passed the front row, I let my gaze fall on those 3 empty wooden chairs for a fraction of a second. I felt no pang of sorrow. I felt no sudden urge to cry. I felt the profound finality of a balanced ledger. I had paid my dues. I had absorbed their shocks for 32 years. Walking past those vacant seats was the moment my debt was permanently canceled. I looked toward the altar. Evan was waiting for me. His eyes were steady and his posture was relaxed. He offered his hand and I took it. The wedding was perfect, and I need you to know that. It was not tainted by their absence. It was elevated by it. The evening transitioned into a plated dinner inside the glass structure. The sun set behind the trees, and the venue staff lit hundreds of white pillar candles. The amber light reflected against the dark window panes. Waiters poured wine, and the ambient noise of clinking silverware and overlapping conversations filled the room. During the dessert course, a well-meaning cousin from Evan's side walked over to our table. She wore a floral silk dress and carried a half-empty champagne flute. She smiled warmly and leaned down. "Your dress is just gorgeous, Willow," she said. "I was looking around for your folks to tell them what a beautiful job you both did, but I missed them. Where are they sitting tonight?" The table went entirely quiet. Sarah froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. The air grew dense. It was the kind of innocent question that usually forces the scapegoat into a corner. Normally, I would fabricate a polite lie. I would say they were feeling under the weather or they had an unavoidable travel conflict. I would protect the person asking the question from the uncomfortable truth. Evan did not let me speak. He shifted in his chair, reached across the table, and placed his hand over mine. He looked up at his cousin with a gentle, polite smile. "Only the family who chose to be here made the guest list," Evan said. His voice was calm and entirely devoid of malice. It was a simple statement of fact. He did not sound angry. He just stated the boundaries of our new life. The cousin blinked, processed the weight of the sentence, and nodded slowly. She possessed the emotional intelligence to recognize a closed door. She touched my shoulder gently, congratulated us once more, and walked back to her table. Evan squeezed my hand and went back to eating his cake. He had deflected the social pressure effortlessly. The next morning, the heavy rain returned to Seattle. Evan and I sat at a metal table near our gate inside the SeaTac airport terminal. We were drinking bad coffee from paper cups, waiting for our flight to Maui to begin boarding. The harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal buzzed overhead. Travelers rushed past us dragging heavy rolling suitcases. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my phone. It had remained powered down since the moment I put it in the nightstand drawer the previous morning. I held the side button and watched the screen illuminate. I did not look at the text messages. I did not check my voicemail to see if Richard or Susan had called in a fit of mourning after guilt. I ignored the notification bubbles entirely. I opened the web browser and navigated directly to my cellular provider account portal. I typed in my password. I clicked on the account management tab. I selected the option to change my mobile number. The screen displayed a warning asking if I was sure I wanted to discard my current 10-digit number. I clicked confirm. The system spun for a few seconds. A new phone number appeared on the screen in bright blue text. I took a sip of my coffee. Just like that, the connection was permanently severed. They could no longer reach into my pocket and disrupt my nervous system. I did not send a parting text message. I did not ask for a post-mortem explanation of their cruelty. I boarded the plane to Hawaii and left them behind in the rain. For 3 years, I became a ghost. I disappeared entirely into my own happiness. Evan and I returned from our honeymoon and settled into our routines. We bought a mid-century house in Bellevue with a sprawling backyard and large windows. I received a promotion to Senior Underwriter at my firm. I joined a weekend hiking group. We hosted dinner parties for our friends where the wine flowed freely and the conversations never involved walking on eggshells. I built a life characterized by deep, ordinary peace. I never checked their social media accounts. I did not know if Mia had purchased another untrained dog. I did not know if Susan was still rearranging the furniture in her living room to accommodate new cheerleading trophies. I did not care. The ghost years were quiet and productive. I assumed the story was over. I assumed they had successfully written me out of their narrative and moved on to a life where Mia was their only concern. But I was completely unaware of the financial machinery grinding to a halt in my absence. While I was assessing risk for corporate clients and planting hydrangeas in my new backyard, a very specific legal clock was ticking down. The peace of those 3 years was an illusion. It was merely the quiet space between the lighting of a fuse and the inevitable detonation. My parents had not let me go because they respected my boundaries. They let me go because they were arrogant enough to believe they could summon me back the moment I became useful again. Deep inside a locked metal filing cabinet in my father's home office sat a stack of documents bearing the name of my late grandfather Thomas. Those documents detailed a generation-skipping trust that was rapidly approaching its maturity date. My father was holding a financial time bomb, and he desperately needed my hand to defuse it. 3 years of silence is a profound kind of peace. When you spend your entire life anticipating the next manufactured crisis, you develop a constant low-level hum of anxiety. Your nervous system is always braced for an impact. Removing my parents from my daily routine turned that humming sound off. The silence was not empty, it was restorative. Evan and I focused on building an environment that reflected our shared values. We purchased a mid-century modern house in Bellevue. It had a slanted cedar roof and wide glass panels that looked out over a deep green lawn. On weekend mornings, we drank our coffee on the back deck, listening to the wind move through the heavy branches of the Douglas fir trees. Nobody called us demanding emergency loans. Nobody asked us to sacrifice our weekend plans to manage a fabricated family emergency. We owned our time. My career accelerated in the quiet space they left behind. I received a promotion to Senior Underwriter. I moved into an office with a door that locked. I spent my days evaluating high-level commercial risk portfolios. I read indemnification clauses line by line, searching for structural vulnerabilities in corporate contracts. I became exceptionally good at identifying hidden liabilities. The deep irony of my profession was not lost on me. I spent 40 hours a week protecting multinational corporations from bad investments, while remaining entirely blind to the financial sinkhole developing in my own family history. To understand the storm that was gathering just beyond the horizon of my new life, you need to understand the man who planted the seeds. You need to know about my grandfather Thomas. Thomas was my father's father. He was a retired maritime logistics director who spent his career managing cargo shipments at the Port of Seattle. He smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and motor oil. Thomas was a pragmatist. He did not measure a person's worth by the volume of their voice or the brand of their shoes. He measured success in tangible numbers. He kept meticulous ledgers. He trusted math and he distrusted vanity. Thomas saw right through my father. He recognized Richard was a man who performed wealth rather than building it. He watched Richard lease luxury sedans to impress the neighbors while failing to pay the local utility bills on time. He watched Susan buy expensive cheerleading uniforms for Mia while ignoring the structural cracks in their own household budget. Thomas loved his son, but he did not trust his son with capital. During my mid-20s, Thomas passed away quietly in his sleep. His passing required a reading of his estate. Thomas left behind a highly lucrative commercial property located right in the heart of the Pioneer Square district in downtown Seattle. It was a beautiful 3-story brick building. The ground floor housed a busy artisanal coffee shop and a boutique retail space. The upper 2 floors were renovated loft offices leased to tech startups. It generated a steady high-yield monthly income. The property was an anchor asset. It was the kind of real estate that ensures generational stability. But Thomas did not leave the deed to my father. Thomas engaged a sharp estate lawyer and drafted a generation-skipping trust. He legally bypassed Richard entirely. He placed the Pioneer Square building into the trust and named me as the sole irrevocable beneficiary. The stipulations of the document were incredibly precise. The trust was set to vest entirely and transfer the unencumbered deed into my name the exact moment I turned 32 years old. Richard was designated merely as the temporary trustee. He was not the owner. He was a caretaker. The legal framework allowed him to collect a modest 8% management fee from the rental income to cover his time handling the maintenance requests and filing the municipal tax paperwork. He was legally barred from touching the principal equity. He was legally barred from selling the asset or leveraging it for debt. His job was to sweep the floors and keep the lights on until I was old enough to take the keys. During my late 20s, I knew the trust existed, but the details were always kept hazy. I was working 3 jobs trying to fund my own existence. Whenever I asked my father about the downtown building, he would wave his hand and sigh heavily. He dismissed the property as a bureaucratic nightmare. He told me the building was tied up in endless municipal red tape and probate court delays. He complained about the rising property taxes and the cost of replacing the old roof. He painted the asset as a heavy burden he was graciously carrying on my behalf. I was too exhausted by the daily psychological warfare of living in that family to hire a forensic accountant. I did not have the extra funds to retain my own legal counsel to audit his claims. I chose the path of least resistance. I let the trust sit in the background and focused on building my underwriting career. I assumed he was telling the truth, but Richard was not telling the truth. During the 3 years I was a ghost, Richard grew dangerously comfortable in his unearned authority. Without me calling on holidays or showing up to family dinners, he began to forget I existed. He stopped viewing the Pioneer Square property as a temporary stewardship. He started treating the building like his own personal checking account. The generation-skipping trust was a strict legal boundary, but Richard lived his entire life believing boundaries did not apply to him. He grew accustomed to the prestige of calling himself a commercial landlord. He funneled the excess rental income to fund his escalating lifestyle. He used the cash flow to buy Susan new living room furniture and to pay the exorbitant credit card bills Mia generated. He treated the property as a permanent fixture in his retirement portfolio. He convinced himself that the daughter he discarded via a 6-word text message would never return to claim her designated space. He believed his own lies so thoroughly that he forgot to check the calendar. Trusts do not care about family politics. Legal documents do not care who was invited to a wedding or who posted passive-aggressive quotes on social media. A generation-skipping trust is a mathematical equation. It is a dormant machine waiting for a specific date to arrive. 3 years into my quiet new life, the calendar turned to October. The rainy season returned to Washington. The Douglas firs in my backyard dripped with cold water. Evan baked a lemon cake from scratch. He lit candles on the kitchen island and poured a rich red wine into glass goblets. We sat on the living room sofa listening to old jazz records while the rain hit the windows. I blew out the candles and celebrated a quiet, peaceful milestone. I turned 32 years old. I went to sleep that night feeling warm and safe. I had no idea that at the exact stroke of midnight, a legal mechanism shifted in a downtown municipal database. The temporary trusteeship instantly dissolved. The 8% management fee evaporated. The legal protective shell Richard relied upon to fund his daily life expired. The next morning, Richard likely woke up, poured his coffee, and reviewed his banking statements. He likely stared at the screen as the automatic transfers failed to clear. The bank holding the trust accounts recognized the date. They locked the outgoing capital. They flagged the file for the final beneficiary's signature required to officially close the trust and transfer the deed into my name. Richard could no longer touch a single dollar of the rental income without my written authorization. His early retirement plan was suddenly frozen behind a door he did not possess the key to open. He had thrown his daughter away for refusing to accommodate 3 untrained dogs at a wedding. Now he realized that same daughter held the legal title to the most valuable asset in his portfolio. He needed me to walk back through the door he had slammed in my face. He needed me to sign a piece of paper surrendering my inheritance so he could keep up his charade. The profound peace of my Bellevue house was about to be interrupted. The orchestrator was preparing a new script. The stage was being set for a reconciliation that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with leverage. The family machine was firing back up and it was heading straight toward my inbox. It started on a Tuesday morning during the first week of November. The sky over Bellevue was the color of wet iron, and a cold wind was stripping the last brown leaves from the oak trees in my backyard. I was working from my home office. The room was designed for focus. I sat in an ergonomic mesh chair facing a wide oak desk. 2 curved monitors illuminated the space. My left screen displayed a complex risk assessment for a corporate shipping client. My right screen held my email inbox. I held a ceramic mug of black coffee, letting the heat warm my palms. The house was entirely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall. I was evaluating an indemnification clause when a white rectangular notification box slid into the top right corner of my primary monitor. My eyes darted toward the movement. I read the sender name first, Susan Carter. My hand stopped halfway to my mouth. The coffee mug hovered over the desk. I had changed my mobile number 3 years ago, sitting in the airport terminal. I had severed the direct line to my nervous system. But I had kept my personal email address. It was tied to my banking profiles, my mortgage documents, and my professional licensing. Changing an email address requires unraveling a decade of digital infrastructure. I had assumed the silence from my parents was permanent. I had assumed they lost interest. I did not realize they simply lacked a financial incentive to search for me until now. I set the mug down on a cork coaster. I moved my mouse and clicked on the notification. The email opened, filling the center of my screen. The subject line read, "Thinking of our girl." I stared at those 4 words. The audacity of the phrasing was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Our girl. They had discarded me with a 6-word text message 14 hours before my wedding. They had left 3 wooden chairs empty in the front row of a botanical greenhouse. For 1,095 days, they did not possess a daughter. Now they were attempting to reclaim ownership with a casual subject line on a Tuesday morning. I took a breath, leaned back in my chair, and read the body of the message. I did not read it as a daughter hoping for reconciliation. I read it with the trained eye of a senior underwriter evaluating a fraudulent insurance claim. I broke the text down, line by line, looking for the hidden liabilities. "We miss you so much, Willow," the email began. Susan did not start with an apology. She started with a declaration of her own feelings, placing the emotional burden immediately onto my shoulders. "We were looking at some old photos in the basement last night," the second line read. "We found the album from that camping trip we took to Mount Rainier when you were 7 years old. You looked so happy sitting by the fire." The underwriter in my brain highlighted that sentence in red ink. It was a calculated pivot. Susan chose a specific memory from when I was 7 years old. That was 3 years before they adopted Mia. She was deliberately bypassing the decade of trauma, the erased achievements, and the unequal ledgers. She was trying to anchor me to a timeline where I was the only child, using weaponized nostalgia to bypass the locked door of my current life. Life is too short to hold grudges, the next sentence dictated. My jaw tightened. Susan was deploying her favorite tactic. She was the silent architect of revised history. When I was 12 years old, she forgot to pick me up from track practice in a heavy rainstorm. When I finally walked 3 miles home, soaked to the bone, she did not apologize. She told me it was a good lesson in self-reliance. She never admitted fault. Now she was framing a 3-year silent exile as my personal grudge. She was rewriting the narrative to make herself the victim of my stubbornness, rather than the author of my disownment. Then I reached the 4th paragraph. The nostalgic preamble evaporated, and the true motive revealed itself in a single buried sentence. Dad has a small piece of estate paperwork for you to sign, the email read. But mostly we just want to see you and catch up over dinner. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I read the sentence again. Dad has a small piece of estate paperwork for you to sign. People do not wait 3 years to apologize because they suddenly locate their conscience. A guilty conscience does not operate on a 1,000-day delay. People break a profound silence because an external force compels them to act. They reach out because a bank teller shook their head, or a financial advisor flagged an account, or a legal deadline materialized on a calendar. The phrase "small piece of estate paperwork" was a glaring contradiction. In the corporate risk sector, we learn early that documents are never small, and estate paperwork is never casual. If a signature is required, it means a legal transfer of liability or asset is taking place. My father was not calling to clear the air. My father was calling because a financial door had locked and my signature was the only valid key. I thought about grandfather Thomas. I thought about the Pioneer Square property and the generation-skipping trust. I remembered my recent 32nd birthday. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with a sharp metallic click. The temporary trusteeship had expired. The asset had vested. Richard was trapped. Susan sent the email because Richard was too proud to beg the daughter he threw away. She dressed the financial demand in the soft clothing of maternal longing. They wanted me to read the email, feel a desperate surge of gratitude for their attention, and blindly sign whatever document they slid across a dinner table. They wanted the compliant shock absorber who used to hide her own trophies in the garage. I moved my mouse, clicked the forward button, and typed Evan into the recipient line. Evan was sitting in his office at the city planning department 10 miles away. I did not write a long explanation. I typed one single sentence. The Trojan horse has arrived. I hit send. I did not reply to Susan. I sat in my ergonomic chair and watched the second hand on my desk clock sweep in a smooth, continuous circle. I knew the opening move was just the bait. If they genuinely needed a signature, they would not rely solely on a vague promise of a dinner date. The actual mechanism of the trap would follow. Exactly 10 minutes later, a second email landed in my inbox. This message did not come from Susan. It came from a sender I did not recognize. The address belonged to a generic corporate domain. The sender name was listed as the Law Offices of Barrett & Cole. I recognized the firm name from a billboard on the interstate near Tacoma. They handled high-volume estate planning, rapid evictions, and standard property transfers. They were a factory for legal paperwork. The subject line of the second email was sterile and precise. Action required, Carter trust document. I opened the message. There was no weaponized nostalgia here. There was no mention of Mount Rainier or campfire photos. The body of the email contained a single paragraph drafted by a paralegal. It instructed me to review the attached document, sign it before a licensed notary public, and return the original copy via certified mail to their Tacoma office at my earliest convenience. At the bottom of the email was a digital attachment. It was a PDF file. The file size was 4.2 megabytes. The document was 15 pages long. A 15-page legal document sent by a retained law firm is not a small piece of estate paperwork. It is a binding contract designed to alter the trajectory of an asset. My parents had constructed a trap built on the assumption that I was still the fragile, desperate girl they discarded. They assumed I would be so overwhelmed by the prospect of their affection that I would skim the pages and sign on the dotted line just to buy a seat at their dinner table. They wanted me soft, grateful, and starving for their validation. They made a profound miscalculation. I am a senior underwriter. I spend my life inside the fine print. I hunt for the hidden clauses that destroy corporate empires. I clicked on the PDF attachment and dragged the file from my inbox over to my secondary monitor. I expanded the document until the text filled the entire screen. I adjusted my blue light glasses. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I did not feel the sting of rejection. I felt the cold, mechanical focus of an auditor preparing to dismantle a fraud. The PDF loaded on my right monitor with the crisp, sterile formatting of a document designed to look entirely unremarkable. I adjusted my posture and began to read. The header on the first page was printed in a standard block font. It read, "Standard Release of Trustee." The opening paragraphs were thick with boilerplate legal terminology. It spoke of discharging duties, indemnifying the caretaker, and concluding the administrative period of the estate. To an untrained eye, it looked like the kind of routine bureaucratic receipt you sign to simply clear out an old filing cabinet. It looked like a formality. My father was counting on that perception. He was banking on the emotional exhaustion that usually accompanies family reconciliation. He assumed I would be so distracted by my mother sending nostalgic emails that I would skim the first page, assume the document was just a harmless administrative closure, and jump straight to the signature line. Richard always treated paperwork as a nuisance. He never read the terms and conditions. He signed car leases without calculating the interest rates and agreed to credit card offers based on the color of the plastic. He assumed his daughter operated with the same reckless impatience. But I do not skim. I underwrite. I read contracts for a living. I know that the most dangerous clauses are never placed on page 1. They are buried deep in the center of the document, where the reader's attention naturally begins to fade. I placed my hand on the mouse and scrolled down. Page 2 covered standard tax liabilities. Page 3 detailed the release of banking records. Page 4 through 10 consisted of mundane operational disclosures regarding building maintenance history. The text was dry, repetitive, and intentionally exhausting. I kept scrolling. Then I reached page 12. The font size did not change. The margins remained identical. But the legal language shifted abruptly from administrative closure to active asset transfer. Buried under a mountain of dense indemnification jargon was a single heading labeled Voluntary Quitclaim and Surrender of Interest. I leaned closer to the monitor. I read the paragraph 3 times to ensure I was translating the legal syntax correctly. The clause was a masterpiece of deceptive drafting. By signing this so-called standard release, I was not just acknowledging the end of my father's temporary management role. I was legally surrendering my status as the primary beneficiary of Grandfather Thomas and his generation's skipping trust. The clause explicitly stated that I was voluntarily transferring the unencumbered deed of the Pioneer Square commercial property directly to Richard Carter. I was gifting him the building. The sheer audacity of the document stripped away any remaining illusion of maternal longing or family reconciliation. My parents did not miss their daughter. They missed my obedience. They had constructed a sophisticated legal heist and wrapped it in the guise of a warm family dinner. I needed to understand the exact scale of the theft. I opened a new browser tab on my left monitor. I navigated to the King County Department of Assessment's public portal. I typed the address of the Pioneer Square property into the search bar. The database spun for a few seconds before generating the current property profile. I had not checked the status of the building in years. I remembered it as a sturdy but aging brick structure. But real estate in downtown Seattle had shifted dramatically during my ghost years. The Pioneer Square neighborhood had undergone aggressive gentrification. The surrounding blocks were now filled with high-end artisanal bakeries, boutique fitness studios, and corporate tech incubators. The property was no longer just a dusty old commercial space. It was a premium historic asset. I scrolled down to the county tax appraisal section. The numbers jumped off the screen. The land value and the structural improvements combined for a total assessed value of $1.4 million. I let go of the mouse. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and stared at the 7 digits glowing on the screen. $1.4 million. That was the price tag on my mother's nostalgic email. That was the value of their sudden desire to reconnect. Richard was not reaching out to fix his fractured relationship with his eldest daughter. He was reaching out to steal $1.4 million from her. He wanted me to hand over a premium commercial asset in exchange for a plate of steak and a fake smile. The mechanics of his plan were glaringly obvious. If I caved to the emotional pressure and signed that PDF, Richard would immediately file the quitclaim deed with the county clerk. The property would transfer into his name. He would secure his early retirement fund, whatever new luxury vehicle Mia wanted, and maintain his facade of wealth. And the very next morning, the warmth would evaporate. The invitations to dinner would cease. The conditional love would be withdrawn the second the ink dried on the notary stamp. My disownment would quietly resume, but this time they would be $1.4 million richer. The betrayal did not hurt. It clarified everything. I felt a cold, surgical calm wash over me. I looked at the quitclaim clause on the right monitor and the property appraisal on the left. The orchestrator had played his hand. He had revealed exactly what he wanted. But a new question formed in my mind. Why the sudden rush? The generation-skipping trust had vested when I turned 32 just weeks ago. If Richard simply wanted to steal the building, he could have tried this maneuver months ago. The urgency of the emails, the retention of a high-volume law firm, the sudden deployment of my mother as emotional bait. It all pointed to an external pressure. Richard was acting like a man who was running out of time. If I signed the document, he got the ultimate payday. But if I did not sign it, I needed to know exactly what would happen to him if I refused. I needed to understand the blast radius of a single unreturned signature. I needed to know what structural pillars in his life were currently resting on an asset he no longer legally controlled. I hit the print command on my keyboard. The laser printer in the corner of my home office whirred to life. It began spitting out the 15 pages of the fraudulent release form. The paper was warm as I gathered the stack from the output tray. I aligned the edges perfectly. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a pristine manila folder. I placed the documents inside and closed the cover. I picked up my cell phone. I did not dial Susan. I did not reply to the generic Tacoma law firm. I navigated to my contacts and found the number from my attorney. He was an independent estate litigator I had consulted through my underwriting firm years ago. He was sharp, pragmatic, and immune to emotional manipulation. He read the fine print faster than anyone I knew. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. "Willow," he said. His voice was brisk and professional. "What kind of risk are we assessing today?" I looked at the manila folder resting on my desk. "I am looking at a voluntary quitclaim deed, disguised as a standard trustee release," I said. "My father is attempting to transfer a $1.4 million commercial property out of my name." I heard the sound of a keyboard stop clicking on his end of the line. "Send me the file," my lawyer said. "I have already printed it," I replied. "I need you to pull the financial disclosures on the property. I need to know what he has been doing with the asset while I was gone. And I need to know exactly what happens to him if this signature never arrives. I will run the title and the attached credit liabilities this afternoon," he said. "Bring the hard copy to my office tomorrow morning." I ended the call. The board was set. My parents were preparing for a sentimental reunion dinner, believing they were reeling in a desperate daughter. They were setting a table in Bellevue to execute a silent robbery. I placed my hand flat against the manila folder. I was going to attend their dinner. I was going to let them perform their script. But they were about to discover that the shock absorber had been permanently replaced by a brick wall. The follow-up email from Susan arrived the very next morning containing a formal invitation. She proposed a reconciliation dinner at a high-end steakhouse located in the center of the Bellevue Financial District. It was a restaurant known for dark mahogany paneling brass fixtures and a clientele who conduct corporate mergers over plates of dry-aged ribeye. The choice of venue was highly deliberate. They wanted a public stage. They believed the hushed atmosphere of wealth and the presence of attentive waitstaff would force me to maintain social decorum. They assumed I would never create a scene in a room full of regional executives. I accepted the invitation. I did not dress for a family reunion. I dressed for an audit. I put on a tailored navy blazer with sharp shoulders and a crisp white silk shirt. I wanted my posture to communicate boundaries before I even spoke a single word. I slid the pristine manila folder containing the 15-page fraudulent document into my structured leather tote bag. I drove to the restaurant under a clear evening sky. The hostess led me through the dining room past tables of people swirling dark wine in crystal glasses. We reached a wide, semicircular velvet booth situated in a quiet corner. My family was already seated. The visual composition of the table was a perfect replication of my childhood dynamic. Richard sat in the center, anchoring the space. Susan sat to his right with her posture stiff and her hands folded neatly in her lap. Mia sat on the outside edge. She was wearing a designer trench coat draped over her shoulders like a cape. The coat retailed for more than my first car. Mia spent her entire adult life launching failed entrepreneurial ventures that Richard quietly bankrolled behind the scenes. She masked her lack of capability with expensive labels and an aura of perpetual exhaustion. She was staring at her phone screen, looking deeply bored by the prospect of my arrival. Richard saw me approaching and stood up. He spread his arms wide and offered a booming, theatrical greeting. "There is my girl," he announced. His voice carried across the adjacent tables. The hypocrisy of the gesture was staggering. 3 years of profound silence. A wedding I attended alone. A phone number I had to change to protect my nervous system. He erased all of it with a loud, jovial greeting in a public dining room. He acted as if the past 1,000 days were just a funny misunderstanding between colleagues. He wanted the waitress and the neighboring tables to view him as a magnanimous, loving patriarch. I did not walk into his embrace. I offered a brief, tight smile, slid into the empty space on the opposite side of the velvet booth, and placed my leather tote bag on the seat beside me. Richard did not miss a beat. He signaled the sommelier and ordered a $100 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon without opening the menu. He was establishing financial dominance. He wanted to remind me that he was the provider and the authority figure. The next hour was a masterclass in performative psychology. They launched into a synchronized routine designed to wear down my defenses. Susan began the assault. When the waitress poured the red wine, Susan lifted her linen napkin and dabbed the corners of her eyes. She shed delicate, calculated tears. She spoke in hushed, tremulous tones about how difficult the estrangement had been for her health. She lamented the missing holidays and the empty chairs at Thanksgiving, but she never once offered an apology. She mourned the distance, but she carefully avoided mentioning the actions that caused it. Richard handled the philosophical angle. He leaned across the white tablecloth and spoke about family legacy. He delivered a monologue concerning the importance of blood ties and forgiveness. He used phrases like letting go of the past and moving forward as a united front. He tried to weave a narrative where my compliance was the only required component for our collective happiness. Mia contributed her designated role of the helpless distraction. When the appetizer plates arrived, she pushed a lump of expensive crab cake around her plate with a silver fork. She complained about the seasoning and sighed heavily. She made sure the table revolved around her minor discomforts, ensuring that no actual deep conversation could take root. She required constant soothing from Susan. I watched the play unfold. I ate my seared salmon. I chewed slowly and swallowed. I said very little. I answered their questions with brief, neutral statements. I did not offer validation. I did not reach across the table to comfort my weeping mother. I did not agree with my father's grand speeches about legacy. I simply existed in the space and let them exhaust their rehearsed scripts. Eventually, the energy at the table began to shift. The main courses were cleared away. The waitress returned carrying a leather-bound dessert menu. Richard waved her off with a polite but firm gesture. He adjusted his suit jacket, his posture straightened. The warm, jovial facade dropped away, revealing the cold, transactional reality beneath it. The performance was concluding, and the bill was coming due. Richard reached down into his leather briefcase resting on the carpeted floor. He retrieved a single sheet of paper. He also pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. He smoothed the paper flat onto the crisp white tablecloth. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was the final signature page of the 15-page quitclaim document. He had separated the signature line from the rest of the text, hoping I would not ask to read the preceding clauses. He slid the paper and the silver pen across the table. The item stopped inches from my water glass. "Just a formality from Grandpa Thomas and his old estate," Richard said. He tapped the signature line with his index finger. His voice dropped into a low, conspiratorial tone. "Sign this, and we can put all the ugliness behind us, Willow." There it was, the ultimate expression of transactional love. The condition of my readmission into the family was laid bare on the white linen. He equated my signature with forgiveness. He was attempting to purchase a $1.4 million commercial asset with a steak dinner and a glass of Cabernet. He believed the weight of the upscale restaurant, the expensive wine, and the sheer societal pressure of the moment would force me to fold. He assumed I would pick up the silver pen and surrender my inheritance just to avoid creating a scene in front of the waitstaff. I looked at the heavy silver pen. I looked at the single sheet of paper. Then I raised my eyes and looked directly at my father. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. The air in the booth grew thick. Susan stopped dabbing her eyes. Mia looked up from her phone screen. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into a distant hum. They were waiting for the compliant daughter to execute her final duty. They were waiting for the shock absorber to take the hit. I reached my hand forward. I rested my fingertips on the edge of the paper, but I did not pick up the pen. "I will need to review this first," I said quietly. My voice did not shake. It was even and detached. The 7 words hung in the space between us. I did not raise my tone, but the impact hit the table with the force of a physical blow. The illusion of the warm family dinner shattered instantly. Richard dropped his mask the exact moment those 7 words left my mouth. The jovial, generous patriarch vanished, the muscles in his jaw locked tight. His eyes narrowed into a cold, flat stare. The ambient noise of the upscale dining room seemed to fade into the background as the tension at our table spiked. "Review it." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "It is standard. Do not be difficult, Willow." I did not flinch. I reached across the crisp white tablecloth and picked up the single sheet of paper. I folded it neatly into thirds. I unzipped my structured leather tote bag and placed the paper securely inside next to the original manila folder. I opened my wallet. I pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I placed the cash flat on the table right next to his untouched silver fountain pen. The money covered my portion of the seared salmon and left a generous tip for the waitstaff. I was not going to let him purchase my compliance with a restaurant bill. I stood up from the velvet booth. Susan let out a sharp gasp and pressed her hand against her chest. Mia rolled her eyes and crossed her arms tightly over her expensive designer coat. I turned my back on them and walked away. I walked through the dining room, pushed open the heavy glass doors of the restaurant, and stepped out into the cool night air. By the time I reached my car and started the engine, the smear campaign had already rebooted. The family machine shifted from the failed honey phase directly into the punishment phase. They realized the sentimental dinner trap did not work. So they reverted to their primary weapon. Over the next 3 days, my digital life turned into an active battleground. They coordinated a full-scale psychological assault designed to break my resolve before the week ended. I woke up the next morning to an email from Mia. The subject line was left blank. The body of the message contained 2 sentences. "You are holding up Dad's retirement because you are greedy. Just sign the stupid paper." She did not understand the legal gravity of the document. She lacked the capacity to comprehend municipal property laws. She only understood that her primary funding source was currently experiencing a stress test, and she blamed me for the inconvenience. The attack quickly escalated beyond my personal inbox. My Aunt Carol decided to bypass my digital boundaries. She utilized her network to track down the direct phone number to my corporate underwriting office. I returned to my desk after a morning risk assessment meeting to find the red light on my office phone blinking rapidly. I lifted the receiver, pressed the voicemail button, and held the plastic to my ear. Aunt Carol spoke with a shrill, trembling pitch. She weaponized panic. "Willow, your father is having chest pains over this stress. He is pacing the floor and his blood pressure is through the roof. Do not ruin this family over a stack of paperwork. Just do the right thing." She painted me as a paranoid, vindictive daughter, holding her ailing parents hostage over a trivial administrative technicality. They wanted me to feel responsible for my father's physical health. They wanted the guilt to become so heavy that I would sign the quitclaim deed just to alleviate my own discomfort. They were sending unhinged messages operating on pure, unchecked emotion, but while they were screaming into the digital void, my attorney was quietly pulling the financial disclosures on the trust. I drove to his office on a Thursday afternoon. His firm occupied a high floor in a sleek glass tower overlooking the Puget Sound. The sky outside was bright and clear. We sat across from each other at a broad mahogany conference table. He did not look amused. He opened a thick legal file and spread a series of printed banking ledgers across the polished wood. What we found in those records was staggering. Richard had not just been passively managing the Pioneer Square property and collecting his authorized management fee. He had executed a highly illicit financial maneuver. He used his status as the temporary trustee to circumvent the protective rules of the generations skipping trust. He approached a secondary commercial lender and took out a high-interest balloon loan. A balloon loan is a specific type of financing that offers low monthly payments for a short duration, but requires the borrower to pay back the entire principal balance in one catastrophic lump sum at the very end of the term. Richard pledged the expected future sale value of the Pioneer Square building as his collateral. He signed a promissory note acting as a shadow owner, borrowing millions of dollars against a deed he did not legally possess. I looked at the highlighted numbers on the spreadsheet. I asked my lawyer where the funds went. He pointed to a column of outgoing wire transfers. The money from the loan did not go toward replacing the roof or paying the municipal property taxes for the building. The funds were funneled directly into a series of private checking accounts. The primary recipient of those funds was Mia. 2 years ago, Mia decided she wanted the prestige of being a fashion entrepreneur. She opened a luxury clothing boutique in a high-rent retail district near the Seattle waterfront. The store stocked imported cashmere sweaters and overpriced silk scarves. It generated virtually zero foot traffic. It was a hollow vanity project designed to give her a title without requiring actual labor. Richard used the illicit balloon loan to pay her exorbitant commercial lease, purchase her dead inventory, and float her payroll. He also used the remaining funds to cover his own country club membership dues and maintain his facade as a wealthy benefactor. He bled my grandfather's legacy dry to fund a fake lifestyle for his favorite child. My lawyer tapped the final page of the loan agreement with his index finger. The term of the balloon loan was expiring. The catastrophic lump sum was coming due in exactly 20 days. The entire scheme relied on a singular, arrogant assumption. Richard planned to force me to sign the voluntary quitclaim deed transferring the property into his name. Once he held the legal title, he intended to immediately sell the Pioneer Square building to a commercial real estate developer. He would use the sale proceeds to quietly pay off the balloon loan before the lender realized the original collateral pledge was fraudulent. He assumed I would always remain the compliant shock absorber. He assumed I would sign the paperwork without reading it. But the trust had already vested. The temporary trusteeship had dissolved the moment I turned 32. He was now 20 days away from a financial cliff. If I did not sign that single piece of paper, he could not sell the building. If he could not sell the building, the loan would default. The commercial lender would call in the debt and launch a formal audit. The audit would expose his gross fiduciary breach. The bank would target his primary residence and seize his personal assets to recover their losses. His early retirement plan would evaporate. The luxury boutique would face immediate eviction. The entire fake empire would collapse into dust. I sat in the quiet conference room, listening to the faint hum of the city traffic, far below the glass windows. Aunt Carol was wrong. Richard was not having chest pains over a trivial family dispute. Richard was having chest pains because he was 20 days away from standing in front of a judge explaining how he committed financial fraud. He was not fighting for my forgiveness. He was fighting to stay out of a courtroom. The orchestrator was cornered. The clock was ticking louder with every passing second. And the daughter he threw away held the only key to his survival. I sat across from my attorney in his quiet office high above the Seattle traffic. The afternoon sun cast long geometric shadows across the polished mahogany conference table. The financial ledgers and the printed 15-page document rested between us. I looked at the black ink on the white paper. I had spent my entire adult life auditing corporate portfolios, but examining the forensic architecture of my own father's, betrayal felt distinctly different. It lacked the usual corporate detachment. My lawyer closed the file folder and took off his reading glasses. He placed them carefully next to his keyboard. He did not offer empty sympathetic platitudes. He respected my profession enough to give me the raw, unvarnished math. If you sign this quit-claim deed, he explained, his voice even and precise, you are doing much more than handing over a premium commercial asset. You are retroactively curing a defective title. You legally gift them the Pioneer Square building, and in the eyes of the bank, you validate the collateral. You absolve him of the severe fiduciary breach he committed by taking out that illicit loan. I traced the grain of the wood on the edge of the table. I processed the legal reality of his statement. My father had committed a crime. He had leveraged an asset he did not own. The document he slid across the white tablecloth at the steakhouse was not just a transfer of wealth. It was a retroactive pardon. He wanted me to fund his getaway car and erase his fingerprints from the crime scene, all with a single stroke of a silver fountain pen. And if I refused to sign it, I asked. My lawyer leaned back in his heavy leather chair. He folded his hands, resting them on his desk. Without your signature transferring the deed, he cannot legally sell the property to satisfy the debt. The balloon loan matures in exactly 20 days. When he fails to produce the catastrophic lump sum payment, the commercial lender will trigger an automatic default. He paused to let the timeline sink in. 20 days. Once the loan defaults, he continued, the bank will initiate standard collection protocols. They will attempt to place a lien on the Pioneer Square property. That is when their risk management department will discover the title is unencumbered and firmly held in your name. They will realize he borrowed millions of dollars against an asset he never had the legal right to leverage. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the ferries cutting across the Puget Sound. The water looked cold and dark. The lender will not just walk away from a loss of that magnitude, my lawyer said. They will trigger the acceleration clause in the promissory note. They will immediately call in the entire debt. Because the original collateral was fraudulent, they will pursue his personal assets to recover the stolen funds. They will place a lien on his primary residence. They will freeze his checking accounts. They will likely refer the file to the state authorities for a formal fraud investigation. His retirement portfolio will collapse entirely. The silence in the office was profound. I listened to the faint hum of the climate control vents. The scale of his impending ruin was staggering. My father built his entire identity on the illusion of limitless wealth. Growing up, I watched him orchestrate a life designed for an audience. He leased luxury vehicles he could not afford. He paid for expensive country club memberships to ensure he was seen drinking scotch with the right local politicians. He bought Mia designer clothing and financed her hollow business ventures to maintain the image of the generous, successful patriarch. He viewed debt not as a liability, but as a tool to purchase prestige. He always believed the rules of gravity did not apply to him. He constructed a glass castle on a foundation of shifting sand. But the most revealing part of his grand scheme was the singular load-bearing pillar he chose to support the entire structure. Richard built his financial future and Mia's fake entrepreneurial success on the absolute certainty that I would remain the compliant, invisible daughter who always said yes. He assumed my trauma would keep me tethered to his approval. He assumed my desperate need for a family would blind me to his theft. He threw me away via a 6-word text message 14 hours before my wedding, fully believing he could just reel me back in 3 years later to write him a blank check. He calculated that 1,000 days of silent punishment would make me so fragile and eager for his love that I would sign away my grandfather's legacy without reading the fine print. He discarded me because I refused to accommodate 3 untrained dogs at a botanical greenhouse. He demanded my total submission over a seating chart. But while he was demanding obedience, he forgot to respect my capability. He forgot that I walked away from his house and became a senior underwriter. He forgot that I married a man who reads civic blueprints for a living. He threw away the only 2 people who possessed the structural logic to actually read the contract he was trying to execute. Sitting in that leather chair, I felt a profound internal shift. For 32 years, I had carried a heavy knot of resentment in my chest. I had mourned the parents I deserved but never received. I had cried over the empty chairs at my wedding ceremony. I had wasted precious energy wishing they would look at me the way they looked at Mia. But looking at those banking ledgers, the resentment evaporated. Anger requires emotional attachment. Grief requires a sense of lingering loss. I felt neither of those things. The messy, complicated feelings of the neglected child vanished. They were replaced by the cold, sterile efficiency of my profession. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt surgical. The invisible ledger of my childhood was finally exposed in the bright light of a commercial law office. My parents did not value my presence. They only valued my utility. I was merely a signature line standing between my father and his financial survival. They had spent my entire life withdrawing from an account they never deposited into. It was time to close the account permanently. I looked across the desk at my attorney. I gathered the printed ledgers and placed them neatly back into the pristine manila folder. I tapped the edges of the folder against the mahogany table to align the paper. "We are not going to respond to their emails," I told him. My voice was steady and calm. "We are not going to answer the frantic voicemails from my aunts. We are not going to send a cease and desist letter or threaten a counter lawsuit." My lawyer raised an eyebrow. He recognized the strategy. "You want to let the clock run out on the balloon loan?" "Yes," I said. "Any legal response from us right now gives him information. Information allows him to pivot. Information allows him to seek alternative high-interest lending to cover his tracks. We are going to give him nothing but silence. We will let the 20 days expire. We will let gravity do its work." My attorney nodded slowly. A thin smile appeared on his face. He reached forward and took the manila folder from my hands, sliding it into a locked filing cabinet behind his desk. "We wait," he agreed. I walked out of the glass tower and took the elevator down to the street level. I stepped onto the damp Seattle sidewalk. The afternoon air smelled like rain and roasting coffee from a nearby cafe. I felt incredibly light. The burden of managing their expectations was gone. But I knew the silence would not last. Richard was operating on a shrinking timeline. The generic emails from the Tacoma law firm had failed. The weaponized nostalgia from Susan had failed. The upscale steakhouse ambush had failed. The smear campaign executed by the aunts had failed to force my hand. When an orchestrator loses control of the narrative and the deadline approaches, they do not surrender quietly. They escalate. Richard was going to realize that digital harassment was not producing the required signature. He was going to decide that he needed to trap me in a room where I could not easily walk away. He was going to summon the entire family to create a physical barrier of guilt and pressure. He was going to set a formal stage for the final showdown. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket as I unlocked my car. I did not need to look at the screen to know the gears of the family machine were turning again. The final performance was being scheduled. Silence is the most effective solvent for an inflated ego. When you stop returning the frantic phone calls and ignore the demanding emails, the orchestrator loses their sense of equilibrium. They do not know how to operate in a vacuum. For 2 full weeks, I gave my family nothing but profound, unbroken silence. The 20-day clock on Richard and his illicit balloon loan was ticking down with terrifying speed. Every sunrise brought him 24 hours closer to default exposure and financial ruin. His initial strategy of utilizing my mother for emotional manipulation failed. His attempt to corner me in a public dining room failed. The coordinated digital harassment campaign executed by my extended relatives failed to produce a single response. The silence starved his leverage. He was running out of time and he was running out of options. When a man who builds his identity on control realizes the reins have snapped, he does not reflect on his mistakes. He forces the issue. He attempts to manufacture an environment where his authority feels undeniable. The email arrived on a Friday afternoon. The subject line was drafted to read like a judicial mandate rather than a family correspondence. It read Final Execution of Documents. I clicked the message open while sitting at my desk. Richard did not bother pretending this was about reconciliation anymore. The text was terse and dictatorial. He bypassed any hollow pleasantries. "We are finalizing this," he wrote. "We have scheduled a formal meeting at the law offices of Barrett & Cole in downtown Seattle for 10 in the morning this coming Tuesday. The whole family will be there. We expect you to show up and do the right thing." I read the short paragraph and pushed my chair back from the monitors. He was deploying his final strategy. He was summoning me to a corporate stronghold. Richard always relied on the physical architecture of intimidation. He believed that heavy oak doors, thick glass partitions, and a receptionist holding a clipboard could strip away a person's agency. He equated expensive leather boardroom chairs with unassailable power. He assumed that placing me inside a high-rise legal office, surrounded by men wearing expensive suits, would trigger my childhood conditioning. He wanted to trap me in a sterile formal setting where defiance would feel like a breach of social etiquette. I could picture the exact stage he was setting. I closed my eyes and visualized the trap with pristine clarity. The law firm would have a sprawling conference room on a high floor overlooking the city grid. A long, polished mahogany table would dominate the space. Richard would arrive early. He would wear his best navy pinstripe suit. He would stand near the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the traffic, projecting the unearned confidence of a wealthy patriarch closing a routine business deal. He would adjust his silver cufflinks and check his expensive watch, acting as though my signature was merely a minor administrative delay. Susan would sit near the center of the table. She would wear a conservative silk blouse and keep her designer handbag resting on her lap like a shield. She would play the role of the anxious peacemaker. She would practice her disappointed sighs and rehearse the specific gentle phrases designed to remind me of my obligations to the family unit. She would be ready to interject with tears the moment I hesitated. Mia would occupy a leather chair at the far end of the room. She would be wearing her oversized sunglasses indoors, slumped in her seat tapping her manicured acrylic nails against the screen of her phone. She would project an aura of extreme irritation. She would act as though her morning was severely inconvenienced by this paperwork dispute. She would play the exhausted victim waiting for her ungrateful sister to stop ruining everyone's schedule so she could get back to running her fake luxury boutique. Then there would be the attorney, the hired muscle. He would sit at the head of the mahogany table. He would have the 15-page fraudulent quitclaim document fanned out across the polished wood. He would place a heavy brass pen precisely next to the designated signature line. He would be prepared to use dense legal jargon to rush me through the reading process. He would point to the dotted line and offer a tight, patronizing smile. They blocked out their entire Tuesday morning for this performance. They choreographed every glance, every sigh, and every subtle threat. They built a snare designed specifically for a fragile, hesitant version of me that ceased to exist 3 years ago. They fully believed the concentrated pressure of a formal legal setting would break my spine, because in their revised version of history, Willow always walked through the door, lowered her head, and took the hit to keep the peace. They expected me to yield to the momentum of the room. The weekend passed quietly. I did not reply to the email. I did not confirm my attendance. I let the summons sit unanswered in my digital inbox. Tuesday morning arrived. The sun breached the Cascade Mountains, casting a pale golden light across the Bellevue suburbs. The air was crisp and clear. The wet pavement in my driveway reflected the bright morning sky. I did not go to my bedroom closet and pull out a tailored blazer. I did not select a pair of professional heels or gather my leather tote bag. I did not search for my car keys. I wore a soft gray cashmere sweater and a pair of loose cotton lounge pants. I walked into my kitchen. The slate tile floor was cool under my bare feet. Evan had already left for the city planning office. The house was entirely silent except for the rhythmic chirping of a few sparrows in the backyard cedar trees. I stood at the long marble kitchen island and began the slow, methodical process of making a pour over coffee. I placed a paper filter into the ceramic dripper. I measured out the dark roasted beans and ground them until the kitchen smelled rich and earthy. I filled the electric kettle and pressed the ignition switch. I listened to the water heat up, the low, rumbling sound turning into a steady hiss. 10 miles away, the actors were taking their positions on the stage. Richard was likely paying for parking in a downtown garage. Susan was likely smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt in the elevator. Mia was likely complaining about the early hour. The attorney was likely arranging the paperwork on the mahogany table. The kettle clicked off. I lifted the handle and poured the hot water over the fresh grounds in a slow, deliberate spiral. The coffee bloomed. The dark liquid dripped down into the glass carafe. I focused on the simple mechanical motion of the water and the rising steam. My breathing was steady. My heart rate was slow and even. They were gathering in a glass tower waiting for the designated scapegoat to arrive. They were preparing to deploy their guilt trips and their manufactured outrage. They were expecting a confrontation. They were expecting me to sit in a leather chair and argue about the past before ultimately crumbling under their collective weight. I poured the hot coffee into a heavy ceramic mug. I walked around the kitchen island and sat on one of the wooden bar stools. I set the mug down on a cork coaster. The ceramic was warm against my hands. I picked up my phone from the counter. I tapped the screen and unlocked the device. I opened my email application and navigated to the message Richard sent on Friday. The harsh, dictatorial words stared back at me. "We expect you to show up and do the right thing." I looked at the digital clock glowing in the upper corner of my phone screen. The numbers read 9:45. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee. The heat bloomed in my chest. I set the mug back down on the coaster. I did not feel a single trace of anxiety. I had zero intention of driving to downtown Seattle. I had zero intention of walking into a corporate law firm to negotiate my own robbery. I was not going to sit across a mahogany table and debate the validity of my own existence with people who only valued me as a signature line. I watched the numbers on the screen shift. 9:50. In the law office, they were likely checking their watches. Richard was likely pacing near the window. Susan was likely gripping her handbag tighter. The attorney was likely checking the lobby with the receptionist. 9:55. The tension in that room was likely thick enough to choke on. The reality of my absence was slowly beginning to penetrate their arrogance. The snare was set. The audience was seated. The trap was ready to snap shut. I stared at the screen as the final minutes drained away. 9:58. I tapped the reply button on the email thread. A blank white composition screen appeared. I did not draft a lengthy defense. I did not explain my reasoning. I prepared to end the entire charade. The clock ticked to 9:59. The performance was about to begin, and the stage was completely empty. The digital clock on my phone flipped to 10 in the morning. I remained seated on the wooden bar stool in my kitchen. The porcelain mug was warm against my hands. I watched the pale sunlight filter through the cedar branches outside my window. 10 miles away, inside a downtown glass tower, the scheduled start time arrived. My father possessed a rigid obsession with punctuality. Growing up, he required me to stand by the front door 5 minutes before any scheduled departure. If I was 30 seconds late, he would leave without me. He used time as a leash. He expected everyone to synchronize their lives to his wristwatch. I took a slow sip of my pour-over coffee and let his schedule pass me by. At 5 minutes past the hour, my phone vibrated against the marble countertop. The screen illuminated, displaying an incoming email from Richard. I did not pick up the device. I leaned forward and read the preview text glowing on the lock screen. "We are waiting. Where are you?" 5 short words. He was clinging to the assumption that I was trapped in Seattle traffic. He still believed the snare was intact. He assumed I was currently sitting in my car feeling a deep sense of panic about keeping him waiting. He could not process the idea of deliberate defiance. 10 minutes past the hour, the phone vibrated a second time. The illusion of a traffic delay had expired. The tone of the new message shifted dramatically. Willow, this is extremely unprofessional. Get here now. He chose the word unprofessional with surgical intent. He did not appeal to me as a family member. He addressed me as an insubordinate employee. He viewed the generation skipping trust as a corporate merger, and he viewed me as a rogue subordinate trying to sabotage his deal. He wanted to shame my work ethic because he knew I valued my career. It was a calculated verbal strike meant to trigger my anxiety and force me into a posture of submission. At 15 minutes past the hour, the third vibration buzzed against the marble. This message came from Susan. She played the designated closer role. Please do not do this to your father. She bypassed the logistics and went straight for the emotional jugular. When Richard failed to command obedience through authority, Susan was always deployed to extract it through guilt. She framed my absence as an active assault on his physical well-being. She wanted me to envision him suffering. She wanted me to believe that staying in my own kitchen was an act of cruelty. I pictured the environment inside the law offices of Barrett and Cole. The air in that mahogany conference room was likely growing stale. The hired attorney was likely glancing at the wall clock calculating his hourly billing rate. Mia was likely complaining about the uncomfortable leather chairs and demanding to know why her morning was wasted. The realization was slowly creeping across the polished wood table. The ghost they summoned was not playing by their established rules. The designated victim had declined the invitation to her own execution. I set my coffee mug down on the cork coaster. The ceramic made a dull thud against the wood. I reached out and picked up my phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the email application. I did not open Susan's message. I opened the thread containing Richard's initial demand and the generic legal instructions from the hired attorney. I tapped the screen and selected the reply all function. I made sure the recipient list included Richard, Susan, Mia, and the lead attorney at the Tacoma firm. Including the lawyer was the most critical tactical decision. The attorney was operating under the assumption that I was a naive relative, willing to sign a standard release form. If the lawyer saw a written declaration establishing my full awareness of the asset ownership, he would be legally obligated to advise his client that the quitclaim strategy was dead. Lawyers do not facilitate transfers when the target explicitly demonstrates knowledge of the fraud. Creating a written paper trail trapped the legal counsel in the reality of my ownership. A blinking cursor appeared on the blank white digital canvas. I did not write a lengthy paragraph detailing my childhood trauma. I did not demand an apology for the empty chairs at my botanical greenhouse wedding. I did not ask why they chose to fund Mia's fake luxury boutique instead of helping me pay for my college textbooks. I did not offer a counter-negotiation. Supplying any of those words would have given them emotional currency. It would have signaled that I still cared about their internal hierarchy. It would have shown them I still wanted their validation. I typed exactly 5 words. I chose a length that deliberately mirrored the terse text message that ended our relationship 3 years ago. You are no longer our daughter. 6 words of exile. I responded with 5 words of financial execution. The property is already mine. I read the sentence once to ensure there were no typographical errors. Then I pressed the blue send arrow in the corner of the screen. I watched the progress bar shoot across the top of the application. The email vanished into the digital ether. It was done. The transaction was complete. I placed the phone face down on the marble island. I slid off the bar stool. I walked over to the kitchen sink and rinsed my coffee mug under the warm tap water. The house remained perfectly still. The only sound was the quiet, steady hum of the refrigerator compressor. There was no dramatic thunderclap. There was no cinematic swell of music. There was just the ordinary peace of a Tuesday morning in Bellevue. I dried the mug with a cotton towel and placed it in the cupboard. The invisible heavy ledger I had carried since I was 14 years old simply ceased to exist. 10 miles away, an entire family structure detonated. I knew exactly how those 5 words would land on that mahogany table. The email would arrive on 4 different devices simultaneously. The attorney would read it first. He would understand the legal implications instantly. He would look at the fraudulent 15-page document resting on the table, reach over, and quietly cap his heavy brass pen. He would inform Richard that the meeting was officially over and the asset transfer was impossible. Richard would read the screen. The blood would drain from his face. The 5 words would dismantle his lifelong illusion of control. He would realize that the compliant shock absorber had secretly evolved into a brick wall. He would realize that I had pulled the King County tax records. He would realize that I knew the temporary trusteeship had expired. He would understand that his plan to sell the Pioneer Square building to cover his illicit balloon loan was dead. The psychological warfare phase of our conflict concluded the exact second I hit send. Emotional manipulation only works when the target cares about the relationship. I had just demonstrated that I only cared about the math. The battlefield was no longer located in my email inbox or in a dark restaurant booth. The battlefield was shifting to the commercial lending department of a major bank. The 20-day clock was about to run out. Without the signed quitclaim deed, Richard had no asset to sell. Without a sale, he had no capital to produce the catastrophic lump sum payment required by his lender. Gravity was taking over. The commercial bank was about to discover that the collateral securing millions of dollars was forged. The consequences were shifting from family tension to federal banking violations. My part in the story was finished. The institutional machinery was about to take over the demolition. The fallout of a defaulted commercial loan is an entirely mechanical process. It does not possess a conscience. It does not factor in family legacy or listen to tearful apologies. Financial institutions operate on algorithms and contractual trigger points. When my 5-word email arrived in that downtown conference room, the emotional warfare ended and the institutional demolition began. The hired attorney at the Tacoma firm read my message and immediately understood his legal exposure. He closed his leather portfolio. He did not yell or express sympathy. He billed his hourly rate, packed his briefcase, and drafted a formal notice of withdrawal. He sent a certified letter to the commercial lender stating that the collateral title was contested and the asset could not be liquidated. He severed his ties to my father and stepped out of the blast radius. The 20-day grace period on the balloon loan expired on a Friday afternoon at exactly 5 o'clock. The catastrophic lump sum remained unpaid. The commercial lender initiated their automated default sequence. The banking system did not hesitate. An algorithmic protocol locked my father out of his online financial portals. His credit lines snapped shut. His checking balances froze. The digital numbers he relied upon to project his phantom wealth turned gray and inaccessible on his computer screen. My parents lived in a sprawling split-level home in a quiet Tacoma subdivision. The property featured a manicured lawn, a fresh coat of slate gray paint, and a 3-car garage. It was the physical stage for their perfect family performance. It was the house where my mother hosted holiday dinners and my father parked his leased luxury vehicles. The bank targeted that stage directly. The risk management department filed a claim to recover their stolen funds. A postal worker walked up their pristine concrete driveway and delivered a certified letter. The heavy envelope contained the formal legal paperwork for a property lien. The commercial lender effectively placed a legal clamp on the Tacoma house. If Richard failed to satisfy the debt, the bank possessed the authority to seize the property, auction it to the highest bidder, and leave my parents standing on the curb. The shockwave radiated outward, hitting the weakest structural pillar of my father's empire first. It hit Mia. Mia built her entire identity on the aesthetics of effortless success. Her waterfront boutique sold imported cashmere sweaters, expensive organic candles, and handmade silk scarves. The retail space featured exposed brick walls and sleek brass clothing racks. She spent her days posting curated photos of her inventory to social media, projecting the image of a thriving young entrepreneur. But the boutique generated zero actual profit. It survived solely on the steady drip of stolen equity Richard funneled from the Pioneer Square trust account. He paid her commercial rent. He covered her inventory invoices. He floated her payroll so she could employ a part-time cashier while she went to long networking lunches. On Monday morning, that financial drip ceased permanently. Mia attempted to place a wholesale order for winter inventory. The corporate credit card declined. She called Richard demanding a rapid cash transfer. Richard could not answer her demands because his own accounts were locked behind a bank fraud investigation. The facade crumbled with terrifying speed. Without the stolen trust money acting as a buffer, the brutal reality of small business economics crushed her vanity project. By the second week, her payroll checks bounced. Her part-time employee quit and filed a wage complaint with the state labor board. The imported scarf vendors halted their shipments and sent collections notices. By the end of the month, the property manager of her waterfront retail space arrived with a heavy brass padlock. A formal eviction notice was taped to the inside of the pristine glass door. Mia was forced to pack her unsold cashmere into black plastic trash bags and load them into the back of her Jeep. The Instagram illusion shattered against the pavement, leaving her with nothing but a failed LLC and a ruined credit score. I did not sit back and watch the wreckage from a distance. I had my own paperwork to process. The generation-skipping trust required final execution. I drove to my attorney's office and sat at the mahogany table. I signed the legitimate vesting documents. The county clerk stamped the official deed. The $1.4 million commercial building in Pioneer Square formally and permanently transferred into my name. A premium real estate asset requires rigorous defense. I did not want to deal with the daily operations or interact with the current tenants. I hired a commercial property management group based in the financial district. They were a team of sharp, unyielding professionals who wore tailored suits and did not smile during business meetings. They specialized in hostile administrative takeovers. I instructed the management firm to sever my father's access to the building immediately. The firm moved with surgical precision. They dispatched a certified letter to Richard officially terminating his temporary 8% management fee and revoking his authorization to enter the premises. They contacted the artisanal coffee shop and the tech startups leasing the upper floors. They provided new routing numbers for the monthly rent checks, ensuring that the income flowed directly into my secure ledger. They sent a commercial locksmith to the Pioneer Square property. The technician changed the digital access codes for the main lobby. He replaced the physical brass locks on the utility rooms and the basement management office. Richard had kept a small, dusty desk in that basement office. He used the space to pretend he was a powerful real estate mogul. He kept a few framed photographs and a stack of old business cards on the desk. My hired management team boxed up his sparse belongings. They placed the cardboard carton on the back loading dock next to the commercial dumpsters. They did not grant him the dignity of a final walkthrough. Richard was 62 years old. He had spent his prime earning years constructing a phantom empire. He avoided hard, honest labor, believing he was too clever to work for a standard paycheck. He treated his eldest daughter as a disposable resource, assuming her trauma would always guarantee her compliance. He built a lifestyle that required me to remain entirely invisible so his favored child could shine in the spotlight. Now he stood in the wreckage of his own arrogant design. He was stripped of his unearned prestige. He faced a staggering accumulation of hidden debt. He stared down a federal banking investigation, a seized checking account, and a lien on the roof over his head. The luxurious lifestyle they paraded for their friends and neighbors turned out to be nothing more than a fragile house of cards. They stacked the deck using my inheritance as the foundation. The entire structure depended on my silent submission. When I simply walked away and removed my name from the bottom of the deck, gravity took over. But people who spend 3 decades lying to themselves do not accept defeat gracefully. They do not look at the ruined landscape and take accountability for the fires they started. When the orchestrator realizes the performance is over and the audience has left the theater, they panic. And panic makes desperate people highly unpredictable. The silence I had cultivated was about to be broken by a frantic, chaotic scramble for survival. The institutional demolition was complete, but the personal fallout was just beginning. When gravity finally reasserted itself inside my parents' house, the tone of their communications shifted overnight. The dictatorial commands evaporated. The aggressive demands for my attendance at downtown law firms vanished. In their place came the frantic, pathetic sound of a family realizing the safety net was gone. Panic operates on a very distinct frequency. It strips away the polished veneer of authority and leaves only raw desperation. I did not need to block their numbers to witness the collapse. I let the incoming messages fall into my voicemail inbox like heavy stones dropping into a deep well. Susan broke first. She had always relied on Richard to maintain the illusion of financial security. She preferred to ignore the mechanics of their wealth, as long as her living room was perfectly decorated and her social calendar was full. With his checking accounts frozen and a bank lien threatening her split-level home, she lost her composure entirely. She left 3 voicemails on a single Wednesday. I listened to them while sitting at my desk reviewing a marine cargo policy. The first voicemail arrived just past 9 in the morning. Her voice trembled. She sounded incredibly small. "Willow. Please pick up the phone," she pleaded. "Dad made a mistake. We are in terrible trouble with the bank. They are talking about taking the house." The second voicemail arrived at noon. The trembling morphed into frantic bargaining. "You do not understand how bad it is," she said. The recording captured the sound of her pacing across a hardwood floor. "You own that building downtown now. You could list it for sale tomorrow. You could just give your father a loan to save our home. We will pay you back. We promise." The third voicemail landed just before 5 in the evening. It was a raw, unfiltered sob. "Please do not let them put us on the street, Willow. You are our daughter." I sat in my ergonomic chair and listened to the digital recordings. I noted her specific phrasing. She still categorized his felony fraud as a simple mistake. She still believed I owed them my commercial asset to cover his theft. She still invoked my status as their daughter only when she required a financial rescue. The word daughter was just a key she was trying to use to unlock a vault. I did not delete the messages. I did not return the calls. I dragged the audio files into a dedicated directory on my desktop. Mia took a very different approach. Mia had never been denied a single request in her entire life. When the commercial landlord padlocked her boutique and the trust funds stopped flowing, she did not know how to process the denial. She lacked the emotional regulation to sit quietly with her failure. She needed a target. On a Thursday afternoon, I was walking across the ground floor lobby of my corporate underwriting firm. The lobby is a vast expanse of polished granite and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Seattle streets. Security personnel monitor the entry points from a circular marble desk. Employees must swipe a coded badge to access the elevators. I was carrying a paper cup of green tea heading back toward the security turnstiles. I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of heels hitting the granite floor. I turned my head. Mia was marching through the revolving glass doors. She looked deeply disheveled. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled. She carried a large leather purse slung haphazardly over her shoulder. Her face was flushed with frantic energy. She spotted me near the elevator bank. She bypassed the visitor sign and sheet and marched directly toward the security barriers. "Willow," she yelled. Her voice echoed off the high granite walls. Several corporate executives in tailored suits paused their conversations to stare at her. I did not run. I stood perfectly still. I took a slow sip of my green tea. "You ruined my life!" Mia screamed across the lobby. She pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You stole Dad's retirement and you killed my business. You are a greedy, vindictive person, and you are going to write me a check right now to fix this." She attempted to push past the metal turnstiles without a badge. A loud electronic buzzer sounded. 2 security guards stepped out from behind the marble desk. They wore dark uniforms and carried radios. They moved with swift, practiced efficiency. One guard stepped directly into Mia's path, blocking her physical access to the elevator bay. The second guard asked her to step back and lower her voice. Mia did not lower her voice. She escalated. She tried to shove the first guard, shouting that she was my sister and she demanded a private meeting. The security personnel did not care about her family tree. They only recognized a physical threat to their corporate environment. They took her by the arms. They turned her around and marched her firmly toward the revolving doors. I watched the scene unfold from behind the glass partition. Mia kicked at the polished floor. She shouted insults over her shoulder. Her face contorted with unadulterated rage. She was stripped of her curated social media persona. She was just an angry, entitled woman being escorted off the premises by building security. I did not intervene. I did not tell the guards to let her go. I threw my empty paper cup into a recycling bin and swiped my badge. The glass gates parted. I stepped onto the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor, leaving her on the sidewalk. The most revealing aspect of the entire fallout was not the panic from my parents or the ambush from my sister. The true measure of the family dynamic revealed itself in the reaction of the extended relatives. For 3 years, my aunts and cousins had flooded my inbox with harsh accusations. Aunt Carol had left seething voicemails at my office calling me a bridezilla and a terrible daughter. Aunt Diane had demanded I apologize to Mia to keep the peace. They had painted me as a cold, ungrateful villain based entirely on the false narrative Susan fed them. But the reality of a banking default is not a private matter. When a commercial lender targets a residential property, the legal filings become part of the public domain. The King County Civil Court records update daily. They are accessible to anyone with an internet connection. In Washington state, a notice of default and a property lien file with the county auditor's office. Small-town gossip networks operate faster than broadband internet. Within a matter of days, the local country club members and the neighborhood associations discovered the truth. They pulled the public records. The documentation clearly outlined the fraudulent balloon loan. The filings detailed how Richard Carter secretly bled his own father's generation skipping trust dry to fund his luxury lifestyle and float a failing retail store. The paper trail proved that the wealth was an illusion. The records proved that the generous patriarch was actually a desperate thief. The family narrative fractured instantly. The aunts and cousins who had attacked me with self-righteous fury suddenly went dead silent. My phone did not ring. My inbox did not receive a single new email from Aunt Carol. The group chats and the passive-aggressive social media posts ceased. Nobody called to apologize to me. Nobody sent a message saying they were sorry for taking the wrong side. They did not reach out to acknowledge their blind complicity in my emotional abuse. They simply vanished into the woodwork. They were deeply embarrassed. They had tied their own social reputations to a man who turned out to be a fraud. They realized they had spent years defending a criminal and vilifying the only person in the family who earned an honest living. Their silence was the ultimate admission of guilt. I sat in my home office on a Friday evening. The rain was falling outside my window, washing the Bellevue streets clean. I opened my desktop computer. I clicked on a digital folder labeled Compliance. Inside that folder, I had meticulously archived every piece of evidence. I saved the 6-word text message that ended my relationship with my parents. I saved the emails demanding my signature on the fraudulent quitclaim deed. I saved the audio files of Susan sobbing and begging for a financial rescue. I saved the security incident report from my corporate lobby detailing Mia's removal. I did not look at the files with a sense of triumph. I looked at them with the calm, steady focus of a closed audit. When someone shatters your life and only attempts to piece it back together because their bank account is empty, you learn a profound lesson about human nature. You learn the difference between genuine remorse and self-preservation. My parents did not regret erasing me from their family. They only regretted that they lost control of the ledger. I closed the folder. I never responded to a single frantic email. I never returned a single sobbing voicemail. I never sent a single dollar to save the split-level house in Tacoma. An apology born of bankruptcy is not an apology. It is just a negotiation. It is a desperate attempt to leverage a biological connection to secure a financial bailout. And my negotiating window closed permanently on a rainy Friday morning exactly 14 hours before I walked down the aisle. It is a Sunday morning in late spring. I am sitting on the back patio of our Bellevue home. The air holds a sharp chill, and it smells distinctly of damp pine needles and fresh rain. Through the sliding glass door, I can hear the quiet clatter of ceramic plates. Evan is inside the kitchen making breakfast. He is humming a low tune while pouring dark coffee into two heavy mugs. Evan was raised in a loud household with four older brothers. His parents were career public school teachers who never possessed a surplus of income but maintained an endless supply of stability. They never treated their children as behavioral investments. They never expected a financial return on their affection. They hosted chaotic Sunday dinners where everyone brought a dish and people spoke over one another with genuine joy. When Evan brought me to my first holiday dinner with them, his mother asked me about my underwriting career with deep, focused curiosity. That sturdy, unshakable foundation is why Evan knows how to build things that last. He is my anchor in a life that finally feels structurally sound. The Pioneer Square commercial property is no longer a dusty monument to my father's vanity. The brutal, competent management firm I retained executed a total overhaul of the tenant roster. The ground floor retail space was entirely gutted. The expensive brass clothing racks from Mia's failed luxury boutique were hauled away in a commercial steel dumpster. The building is currently leased to a rapidly expanding tech startup. The new tenants specialize in corporate cybersecurity software. There is a profound poetry in a company designed to detect digital fraud, occupying the exact physical space recovered from a prolonged family deception. The tech firm signed a 10-year, triple-net commercial lease. They cover the municipal property taxes, the building insurance premiums, and all routine structural maintenance. This arrangement insulates me from the daily operational burdens of being a landlord. They pay their substantial rent via an automated clearinghouse network on the first morning of every single month. There are no excuses for delayed funds. There are no tearful phone calls about slow retail traffic. There are no demands for unearned sympathy. It is a clean contractual relationship based entirely on mutual reality. The monthly income arrives in my designated ledger without a single trace of emotional manipulation attached to it. But maintaining a clean ledger requires constant vigilance. Toxic systems do not disappear overnight. They create legal ripples that wash up on your shore for years. Yesterday afternoon, my property manager forwarded a thick manila envelope to my home address. It contained a formal legal notification from the Federal Bankruptcy Court of the Western District of Washington. Richard had officially filed for Chapter 7 liquidation. The federal court was notifying all individuals connected to his past financial records. The document listed his seized assets, his outstanding commercial penalties, and his scheduled creditor hearings. Holding that heavy federal document presented a new internal conflict. The natural human instinct is to read the pages looking for validation. The temptation is to scan the itemized list of his ruined empire and feel a sense of triumphant vindication. I stood by the kitchen recycling bin holding the stack of legal paper. I felt the gravitational pull of the old dynamic attempting to drag my attention back into his chaotic orbit. I realized that consuming his failure was just another way of letting him consume my time. I did not read the itemized list. I walked into my home office and fed the entire packet into the mechanical teeth of my cross-cut paper shredder. I listened to the harsh grinding noise. I watched the steel blades turn the federal bankruptcy notice into tiny, unrecognizable ribbons of white confetti. I emptied the plastic bin into the trash and walked away. I do not absorb the commercial property income into our daily household budget. Evan and I earn enough from our own careers to fund our lifestyle. I walked into my local bank branch on a Tuesday afternoon. I sat across from a personal banker and opened a dedicated high-yield educational savings account. I held a standard plastic pen and signed the legitimate forms with my actual signature. I linked the automated commercial rent payments directly to this new isolated fund. The money is sitting there right now. It is growing quietly and compounding interest behind a wall of strict financial protection. It is waiting to become a college fund for the children Evan and I plan to have in the coming years. Those unborn children are the true beneficiaries of the generation skipping trust. When those children arrive, they will never know what it feels like to be an afterthought in their own home. They will never have to work a weekend shift at a coffee shop to afford a standardized test preparation manual. They will never watch their academic trophies shoved into a damp cardboard box in a garage to make room for a golden child. They will never have to earn their designated space at our dinner table. People looking at this situation from the outside might accuse me of cruelty. Extended relatives and neighborhood gossips often prefer to blame the person who sets the boundary rather than the person who committed the theft. They say I let my father lose his retirement. They say I forced my parents into a staggering financial collapse. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of structural engineering. My father did not lose his retirement because I was vindictive. He lost his retirement because he built his entire future on a fatal miscalculation. He built a grand, towering lifestyle on the assumption that I possessed zero self-worth. He believed he could treat me as a disposable resource for 3 decades and then summon me to sign a blank check the exact moment he required capital. He orchestrated a smear campaign to protect his fragile ego, not realizing he was actively cutting the very safety net he planned to steal. He sent a text message to disown me over a wedding seating chart and accidentally drafted his own financial suicide note. Strength is not about carrying the heavy burdens assigned to you by toxic people. Strength is about identifying which burdens actually belong to you and letting the rest drop to the floor. I let my family drop to the floor. The impact shattered their illusion, but it preserved my sanity. I am 32 years old. I own my home. I own my career. I own my name. Nobody signs my documents but me. If you are listening to this right now and you recognize the pattern, you are not alone. If you have ever been the designated family scapegoat expected to finance the golden child's life with your silence and your sanity, drop the phrase "been there" in the comments below. Tell me your story. I want to read it. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to stop absorbing the shock of other people's bad decisions. You are allowed to keep exactly what is yours. Do not let anyone convince you that protecting your peace is a crime. Hit the subscribe button to hear more stories about breaking the cycle. And remember to always read the fine print. I am Willow, and I am glad you are here. Glad. It is quiet in Bellevue tonight. The rain has finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. I am sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of tea, looking at the empty space where a heavy, invisible ledger used to sit. The dust has settled, the commercial property is secure, and my parents' financial house of cards has collapsed under the weight of its own deception. Looking back at the wreckage of the last 3 years, I do not feel anger or bitterness. I just feel a profound structural clarity. Surviving a family machine that treats you as a utility rather than a daughter leaves you with scars, but it also leaves you with an unshakable blueprint for survival. If there is anything my journey has taught me, it comes down to 4 fundamental truths. First, I learned that silence is the most impenetrable boundary you can build. For decades, I thought I had to explain my feelings to be respected. But when dealing with manipulative orchestrators, your words are just ammunition they use to rewrite the narrative. When you stop explaining and simply walk away, you starve their leverage. Second, I learned that an apology born out of bankruptcy or a looming deadline is not an apology. It is a negotiation. True remorse does not wait 3 years for a commercial loan to default. When someone only remembers your value because their bank account is empty, they are not looking for forgiveness. They are looking for a bailout. Third, I learned that blood is a biological coincidence, not a blank check. Family is not defined by the people who demand you shrink your life so their golden child can expand. Family is defined by the people who show up for you, like Evan sitting with me on that cold tile floor before our wedding, and remind you that your peace is worth protecting. Finally, I learned to always read the fine print, not just on legal documents, but on every relationship in your life. Your signature, your time, and your sanity belong exclusively to you. You are never obligated to finance someone else's delusion with your hard-earned reality. If you have survived a dynamic like this, I want you to know that you are allowed to close the account. You are allowed to walk away. Thank you for staying with me to the very end of this journey. If my story resonated with you, Please leave a comment, hit the like button, and make sure to subscribe to PV Vengeance for more narratives about breaking toxic cycles and reclaiming your life. I am Willow, and your peace is worth the price.